The walls of Dr. Mitchell's office were lined with diplomas and abstract art meant to calm the storm of broken hearts and frayed trust. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and mint, and the leather chair I sat on creaked as I shifted. Elise was next to me, her fingers tracing a pattern on the armrest, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize over the years. "So, what do you think has been the main issue recently?" Dr. Mitchell's deep, even voice filled the room. He leaned forward, pen poised above his notepad. I glanced at Elise, waiting for her to answer. Her eyes darted between us, calculating. "It's been complicated," she finally said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips as if daring me to contradict her. "Complicated," Dr. Mitchell echoed, his gaze flickering to her with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. My gut clenched, a reaction that seemed to arrive out of nowhere. Elise shifted in her seat, her leg brushing against mine in a motion so quick I wondered if it was deliberate. The room's silence grew thick as Dr. Mitchell's eyes lingered, moving just slightly to follow her motion. There was a flicker in his expression, barely perceptible but undeniable, that made the hair on my neck prickle. "Trust," Dr. Mitchell continued, drawing my attention back. "That's where we'll start. Can you both describe what trust means to you in this marriage?" Elise opened her mouth, but I jumped in. "Trust means not having to second-guess someone you've shared your life with for 7 years," I said, my voice tauter than I intended. Elise's eyes met mine, shadowed with something I couldn't quite read. "Fear? Guilt?" I swallowed, feeling foolish for seeing ghosts in glances and half-spoken sentences. She finally spoke. "Trust is feeling safe, even in the silences." She shot Dr. Mitchell a glance, something unspoken passing between them. He nodded subtly, but it was enough. Enough to set off alarms I hadn't even known were installed in my mind. The session ended faster than I expected. Elise stood abruptly, giving a too bright smile. "I'll see you at home," she murmured, pressing a kiss to my cheek that felt rehearsed. Before I could reply, she was gone, her heels clicking down the hallway. Dr. Mitchell stood too, adjusting his tie as I lingered, trying to convince myself that the tension I felt was baseless. "She's working hard on this, you know," he said suddenly, his tone measured, almost offensive. I forced a smile, nodded, and stepped into the hallway, the echo of Elise's footsteps still ringing in my ears. I didn't know it yet, but this was the first crack in a foundation that would soon crumble faster than I could piece it back together. Days passed with a mechanical predictability that felt almost reassuring, but the tension Elise carried home from our sessions left the air heavy. Her laughter had become hollow, the curve of her smile brittle. We still shared dinner, made idle conversation, and sat side by side in bed pretending to read, yet the distance between us was vast, an invisible chasm no words could bridge. It was at our next session that everything started to shift. I was early, sitting alone in Dr. Mitchell's office while the clock ticked in agonizing rhythm. He entered, nodding curtly as he set his briefcase on the desk. We exchanged polite small talk, his responses clipped, as if he were anticipating something more significant. Just then, the door swung open, and Elise rushed in, cheeks flushed, hair slightly out of place. Her breaths came short and shallow, as though she'd sprinted the last few steps. "Sorry," she muttered, dropping into her chair without looking at me. I noticed her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her skirt. Dr. Mitchell's gaze didn't move from her, the practiced neutrality of his face softening for an instant, like a crack letting light slip through. "Thank you for coming," he said, eyes resting on her a beat longer than necessary. I glanced at Elise, hoping to catch her eye, but she stared fixedly ahead, avoiding my gaze as if it were a burning flame. The session played out in half-heard questions and scripted answers. I was numb, lost in a haze of confusion that thickened every time Dr. Mitchell's focus lingered on Elise with a warmth that shouldn't have been there. Elise's voice broke into my thoughts. "I just feel misunderstood," she said, a tremor lining her words. The room seemed to tighten as Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, empathy pooling in his eyes. "You deserve to be seen, Elise," he said quietly. His voice dropped lower, almost intimate. The moment stretched, seconds that felt like years. Something visceral coiled inside me, a warning bell I could no longer ignore. "I think we're done here for today," I said abruptly, cutting through the spell they seemed to share. Both of them blinked as if woken from a dream. Elise shot me a quick, guilty look, while Dr. Mitchell's professional mask slid back into place, but not fast enough to erase the moment of connection I'd just witnessed. Back in the car, Elise stayed silent, eyes fixed on the road. I could see the pulse in her neck, quick and erratic. "Is there something I should know?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. "No," she said too fast. The single word sat between us like a barricade, daring me to push past it. At home, the routines of our life continued, but beneath them, an unspoken tension pulsed. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while Elise's breathing deepened into sleep beside me. I replayed the session in my mind, dissecting glances and inflections, searching for a reason to doubt my suspicions. But the truth sat like a stone in my chest. The next day, I lingered by the hallway as Elise readied herself for an errand, slipping into a dress she usually reserved for special dinners. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just out," she said, too breezy, reaching for her bag without meeting my eyes. I nodded but felt the first crack of denial give way to anger. I waited 15 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. Heart pounding, I trailed her down streets I knew by heart, watching her weave through traffic with an urgency that didn't belong to a simple shopping trip. She stopped in front of an upscale cafe, and my breath hitched when Dr. Mitchell stepped out, his hand lifting in a subtle, familiar wave. They didn't see me, but I saw them, and in that moment, the fragile web of doubt snapped, leaving only raw truth. I turned away, the taste of betrayal sharp in my mouth. The world around me blurred, and I was already imagining the confrontation, the confessions, the collapse. The evening air felt like a weight pressing against my chest as I drove home, hands clenched on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind buzzed, fragments of conversations and suspicious glances tangling together in a messy web that I couldn't unravel. Elise's voice played in my head on an endless loop, her soft laughter, her sharp rebuttals, the way she used to whisper secrets in the dark. But the Elise who met Dr. Mitchell at the cafe wasn't the same woman I'd known. Or maybe she was, and I'd just never seen it. The thought made my stomach churn. I walked into the house, the creak of the front door slicing through the silence. Elise was already back, standing at the kitchen counter with her back to me, pouring a glass of wine. The scene was almost domestic, almost normal, except I could see the tension in her shoulders, the too casual way she held the glass to her lips without drinking. "How was your day?" I asked, the question tight and mechanical. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes wide for a second before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Good. Just ran some errands." The lie slid off her tongue with such ease that I wondered how many times she'd done this before, spun little half-truths to keep me complacent. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to accuse her, demand answers, lay everything bare between us right then and there. But something held me back, a dull, twisted hope that I was wrong, that this was all some mistake born of paranoia and frayed nerves. "You've been quiet lately," she continued, sipping her wine. "Is everything okay?" The way she asked, her eyes feigning concern, made me want to laugh. I could feel the cracks in my composure spreading, a dam ready to burst. "Just tired, I managed." The words tasted like defeat, but it bought me a moment. Her eyes lingered on me, searching for something. Doubt? Suspicion? It was impossible to tell, and before I could decipher it, she turned away. As the night deepened, we moved through our routines like actors in a play we'd performed 1,000 times. Dinner, small talk, the clink of silverware against plates. But the pauses grew longer, the silences heavier, the spaces between us stretching like taut wire. Later, I watched Elise under the glow of the bedside lamp as she read. Her eyes flicked across the page, but the subtle shift of her jaw told me she wasn't absorbing a single word. I wanted to reach out, pull her into a confrontation that would rip away the illusion, leave nothing but truth in its place. Instead, I lay back, listening to the rhythmic turn of pages and the thrum of my pulse. "I ran into someone today," I said finally, my voice low. It wasn't true, but I needed to see her reaction. Her hands stilled. She looked up, eyes carefully blank. "Oh, just someone from work." I lied, testing the way her shoulders relaxed when the threat dissolved. I caught the brief exhale she tried to hide, and my heart clenched. "Funny how life can surprise you," I added, my voice edged. Her eyes narrowed slightly, just a flicker of recognition before she forced a smile and turned back to her book. Sleep came in fits that night, dragging me under only to jolt me awake with images of Elise leaning across a table, eyes locked with someone who wasn't me. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stand another day of pretending. Elise was still asleep when I slipped out of bed and drove to Dr. Mitchell's office. It was early enough that the parking lot was empty, the sun casting long, thin shadows across the pavement. I sat there, hands shaking, until the first slivers of light touched the window. The door opened, and Dr. Mitchell stepped out, pausing when he saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The facade of calm he always wore cracked, just slightly, as he gave a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that made my blood run cold. He knew, and so did I. The morning sun painted streaks of orange across the kitchen wall as Elise wandered in, eyes still soft from sleep. I sat at the table, fingers drumming against a cold cup of coffee, watching her in the quiet. Her gaze slid to me, and something shifted behind her sleepy expression. "You're up early," she said, voice tentative, wary. She poured herself a cup, the clatter of the spoon against ceramic cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I couldn't sleep," I said, staring at the dark liquid swirling in my mug. The memory of Dr. Mitchell's face, that subtle nod, hung between us like smoke. "We need to talk." She hesitated, hand hovering above the sugar bowl, eyes darting up to meet mine. There was a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. She sat across from me, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "About what?" she asked, though her voice lacked true curiosity. It was a stalling tactic, and we both knew it. "You and Dr. Mitchell," I said, the name sounding bitter as it rolled off my tongue. Her eyes flinched, just a twitch, but enough. The kitchen, once a place of warm Sunday breakfasts and shared secrets, felt colder than ever. Elise's mouth opened, then shut, her lips forming unspoken words before she looked down, fingers clenched around her cup until her knuckles paled. I waited, anger and something darker coiling tight in my chest. It just happened," she whispered finally, each word slipping out like a confession torn from her throat. I inhaled sharply, the world around me blurring as a rush of betrayal drowned out everything else. "Just happened?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "Affairs don't just happen, Elise." Her eyes filled with tears, spilling over even as she tried to blink them away. "I never meant for any of this. I was lost." And he listened. A cruel silence followed, wrapping itself around the room as I processed her words. My mind flooded with memories, piecing together months of hollow affection, sidelong glances, and missed conversations. It was as if I had been watching the disintegration of my marriage in slow motion, only now seeing the sharp edges for what they were. "Did you love him?" I asked, the question jagged, leaving a raw ache in my throat. "No," she said too quickly. "No, it wasn't like that." Her hands moved, reaching out across the table before retreating when I didn't move. "It wasn't love. It was escape. Escape." The word landed heavily, settling into the silence with an ugly finality. What was I to her then? A cage? A mistake? I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the floor. "And what am I supposed to do with that, Elise?" My voice rose despite myself, and she flinched as if struck. Guilt warred with fury, but the anger was stronger, hotter, consuming. "Do you think I wanted this?" she shouted, breaking her composure at last. "I know I broke everything. I know I hurt you. But you were gone long before that first session, before everything turned sideways. Don't you dare put this on me," I said, fists clenching at my sides. I was here. I chose to stay when things got hard. I didn't run to someone else. A sob racked her body, her hands covering her face. For a moment, I felt a sliver of pity cut through my anger. But it was short-lived, drowned out by the image of her leaning close to Dr. Mitchell, sharing secrets that were supposed to be mine. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice muffled and weak. "I don't know how to fix this." I stared at her, the woman I had promised forever to, and realized the truth that hurt most of all. There was no going back, no fixing this. The life we had built, the trust one had nurtured, had been shattered beyond repair. And as the weight of her betrayal settled over us, I felt the first, undeniable seed of something I'd avoided admitting. I wasn't sure I wanted to fix it either. I left the house after that, letting the slam of the front door speak the words I couldn't. The cool morning air bit at my face as I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, past manicured lawns and parked cars that reflected the pale light of dawn. My heart pounded a relentless beat, anger warring with grief until they fused into one jagged, painful thing. The streets were empty, the world still holding its breath before the chaos of a new day. I slowed at a park where we'd once pushed each other on swings, laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. The memory twisted, tainted now like something stolen from a better version of us that no longer existed. My phone buzzed, snapping me from the spiral of thoughts. I fished it from my pocket. The screen lit up with a message from a number I recognized instantly. Dr. Mitchell. My fingers tightened around the phone, the urge to throw it rising like bile. Instead, I tapped it open, heart thundering as I read. "We should talk. You know where to find me." Arrogant. Condescending. The words were a dare. I pocketed the phone, setting my jaw as I turned in the direction of his office, my strides long and fueled by rage. By the time I reached the parking lot, the first hint of morning rush was beginning, commuters oblivious to the storm inside me. Dr. Mitchell's office was on the second floor of a beige, nondescript building. The fluorescent light hummed as I climbed the stairs, each step a drumbeat echoing in my chest. I pushed open the door to the waiting room, where the receptionist looked up, startled. "I need to see Dr. Mitchell," I said, voice cold and clipped. The receptionist hesitated, eyes darting over my face, assessing. I must have looked unhinged because she didn't argue, only motioned to the closed door down the hall. I didn't knock. The handle turned under my grip, and I entered to find Dr. Mitchell leaning back in his chair, as if expecting me. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable but confident. He gestured to the chair across from him, the same one I'd sat in so many times before, a participant in my own undoing. "Close the door," he said calmly. I left it open, crossing my arms as I stood just inside the threshold. "You're a coward," I spat. "You knew everything, every fear, every crack in our marriage, and you used it." He tilted his head, eyes sharp but unruffled. "You think this is simple, that there's only one side to betrayal. But tell me, when was the last time you looked at Elise and really saw her?" His voice was smooth, practiced. It cut deeper than I wanted to admit. "Don't lecture me," I said, heat rising to my face. "You're supposed to help people, not tear them apart. You preyed on her when she was vulnerable." He sighed, as if the weight of my accusations were merely tiresome. "I never forced her hand. She made choices just as you did, just as you're doing now." The calmness in his tone, the smugness that curled the corner of his mouth, made my hands itch to break the impassive mask. But violence wasn't who I was. It wasn't who I wanted to become, no matter how deep the betrayal cut. "She was my wife," I said, voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "And I'm not the villain you need me to be," he interrupted, eyes narrowing. "But you came here for something. So what is it? Closure? Revenge? Or are you just trying to find out if there's anything left to salvage?" Silence swallowed the room, and for a moment, I could hear only the sound of my own breathing. The answers to his questions were tangled, indistinguishable. I didn't know why I'd come here, what I wanted from him besides the impossible, to undo what had been done. The door behind me clicked as I stepped back, out of the room and into the dim hallway. I didn't look at him again, didn't listen for what he might say next. The echo of my footsteps followed me out, each one taking me further from the man who had taken everything, but also from the version of myself that had let it all happen. The drive home was a blur, my knuckles stiff from gripping the wheel too hard, eyes fixed but unfocused. Every turn of the road felt automatic, as if my body knew the way, but my mind had detached, lost in an endless loop of questions with no answers. The early morning haze had cleared, giving way to harsh light that exposed everything, left no shadows to hide in. When I stepped into the house, the silence met me like an old adversary. Elise sat at the dining table, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Her eyes were puffy, rimmed with red, and she flinched slightly when she saw me. It was as if the mere sight of me was enough to shatter her fragile composure. "We need to talk," I said, the words a tired echo of the conversations we'd avoided for too long. She nodded, but her gaze dropped, eyes landing somewhere on the floor between us. I walked to the window, the sunlight slanting across the room and casting uneven patches on the walls. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before she finally spoke. "It started after one of our sessions," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I felt invisible here with you, and then he noticed me." The simplicity of the statement belied its weight, and my chest constricted, the ache sharp enough to draw breath away. I wanted to respond, to tell her that I had always noticed, that I had been there even when the silence grew too large. But words seemed futile, mere patches over a gaping wound. "I needed something I couldn't find here," she continued, eyes glistening as she looked up at me. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even forgive myself." I turned to face her, taking in the lines of guilt that marred her face, the way her shoulders trembled with barely contained grief. The anger that had fueled me for days dimmed, leaving a raw, hollow space. "You could have talked to me," I said, not with accusation, but with exhaustion. "You could have told me how lost you felt." "I did in my way," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "But we were both so wrapped in our own hurt that we didn't see each other anymore." She reached out as if to close the distance between us, but stopped halfway, fingers hovering in the air. I stared at the hand that had once fit perfectly in mine, now a stranger's gesture. The urge to pull away, to retreat behind the armor of bitterness, was strong. But so was the temptation to grasp it, to hold on and pretend that maybe, somehow, we could fix what had been shattered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the sound trembling as it fell between us. The sincerity in her voice reached something deep, pulling at threads I thought had been severed. My throat tightened, and I turned back to the window to hide the conflict that must have been clear in my eyes. "Sorry doesn't change it, Elise," I said, the words catching. "It doesn't undo it." "I know," she said, swallowing hard. "But I need you to know that it was never about love. Not the kind that mattered, anyway." A bitter laugh escaped me, sharp and unbidden. "The kind that mattered," I repeated, shaking my head. "Is that supposed to help?" She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, eyes wide with a desperation that mirrored my own. "No, but it's the truth. And the truth is all I have left to give." The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It thrummed with the weight of every unsaid word, every regret we'd stacked between us over years. I turned to her, finally meeting her eyes fully, and saw the woman I'd fallen in love with beneath the guilt and the grief. I saw her struggle, saw her breaking as I had been, and for a moment, we were just two people standing in the rubble of a shared life. "Then we start there," I said, voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking against the darkness. But it wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was a beginning, one that might lead to understanding or to the final end. Only time would tell. The days that followed were a strange, delicate dance of familiarity and distance. Elise and I moved through our routines like two actors in a play we'd forgotten the lines to, improvising scenes we once knew by heart. The nights were the hardest. The silence between us was not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that left room for ghosts. Memories of whispered conversations that weren't mine, stolen glances that played over in my head like a cruel loop. I caught myself watching her sometimes, searching for traces of the woman who had laughed with me over burnt pancakes and shared inside jokes late into the night. But she was changed, as was I, and every stolen glance felt like picking at an unhealed wound. One evening, the tension finally cracked open. Elise stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for a dinner we'd eat with more silence than words. Her back was to me, her shoulders tense under the soft glow of the kitchen light. I hovered by the doorway, trying to piece together the courage to speak. "I miss how we used to be," I said finally, the words tumbling out like stones. She stilled, the knife pausing mid-motion. A second passed, then two, before she put it down and turned to face me. Her eyes were tired, ringed with shadows I hadn't noticed until now. "I do too," she said softly. The space between us pulsed, heavy with shared sorrow. "Why am?" The question came out before I could stop it, raw and aching. It wasn't the first time I'd wondered, but hearing it aloud made the reality feel sharper. Elise looked down, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "It wasn't really about him," she admitted. "He was just there when I needed to feel something different, when I needed to feel wanted." Her voice broke on the last word, and I felt an unexpected sting of empathy. Was I really that absent? I asked, hating the vulnerability in my voice, but needing the answer more than my pride could guard against. She stepped closer, hesitant, eyes filled with regret. "We both were," she said, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but stopping short. The space between her fingertips and my skin felt like an unbridgeable chasm. We were so wrapped up in surviving day to day that we forgot how to see each other. Her words struck a chord that resonated deep within me. I thought of all the days when exhaustion had weighed me down, when small gestures had gone unappreciated, when her laughter had seemed like background noise instead of something I cherished. The gap between us hadn't been built in a day. It had grown, slowly, insidiously, as we both looked past each other instead of at each other. "So what now?" I asked, not sure if I was ready for her answer. Elise took a breath, eyes glistening as she looked at me with a mix of hope and resignation. "We try," she said, her voice trembling but certain, "or we walk away." The choice hung in the air, suffocating in its finality. A part of me wanted to run, to leave before the hurt could swallow me whole. But another part, the part that remembered her laugh, the warmth of her hand in mine, the years that had once felt unbreakable, wanted to fight, even if I wasn't sure how. "I don't know how to start," I confessed, the admission leaving me exposed raw. "Neither do I," Elise said, a sad smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe starting means learning how to be here, now, in the mess." I nodded, not because I felt ready, but because she was right. We stood in that shared silence, not fixed, not whole, but not shattered beyond repair either. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough to try. The road ahead was uncertain, each step a risk, but I could feel something stir in that fragile quiet, a seed of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. Or at the very least, forward. Days bled into weeks as we navigated the uneven terrain of rebuilding, a path strewn with uncertainty and unspoken questions. Elise and I made tentative attempts at normalcy, a shared dinner here, a quiet movie night there. But each effort felt wrapped in gauze, softened by the awareness of what lay beneath. We spoke more, but always with a hesitance that underscored our conversations. Like walking a tightrope we weren't sure could hold our weight. One evening, Elise suggested we take a drive to the beach, a place we hadn't visited in years. The idea surprised me, but I agreed, if only to break the cycle of tense silences and cautious gestures. The road stretched out before us, the sky bruised with hues of purple and gold as the sun sank behind the horizon. She turned on the radio, and the familiar melody of an old song we used to love filled the car. It was enough to make the air between us feel less stifling, even if just for a moment. The beach was nearly empty, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore, carrying the salt-laced wind that chilled my skin. We walked side by side, feet sinking into the cool, damp sand, the space between us both a comfort and a reminder of the distance we'd yet to cross. "Do you ever think about what went wrong?" Elise asked, her voice quiet but clear over the surf. She didn't look at me, eyes fixed on the water, as if it held the answers we were searching for. "All the time," I admitted. The honesty stung, but I knew there was no room left for half-truths. "I think about how easy it was for us to drift, to become strangers in the same house." She nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself, as if shielding against a deeper cold. "I think that's what scares me the most, that it could happen again." The confession lingered, heavy and real. The waves rolled in, relentless and indifferent, while I considered her words. The fear wasn't hers alone. It had planted itself in me too, taking root in every shared silence, every hesitant touch. The temptation to recoil, to guard against further pain, was strong. But I'd made a choice to try, and trying meant facing the possibility of failure head-on. "It could," I said, the admission raw but necessary. "But we can't pretend that what we had before was perfect. Maybe the point is to figure out if we can make something better out of what's left." Elise's eyes glistened in the fading light, tears she didn't bother to hide. "Do you believe that?" she asked, the hope and fear in her voice mirroring my own. "I want to," I replied. It was the closest I could come to certainty, and for now, it was enough. The vulnerability that passed between us was both terrifying and liberating, a reminder that trust wasn't something given, but something earned, step by painful step. We sat in the sand, side by side, letting the silence settle. This time, it didn't feel as oppressive. It felt like the space we needed to breathe, to process, to exist without the weight of expectation. The sound of the waves filled the gaps, a steady rhythm that seemed to promise continuity even in the face of upheaval. "Will it ever stop hurting?" she asked after a long pause, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't know the answer. The pain of betrayal, the shadow of doubt, it all felt as permanent as the tides. But I reached for her hand, threading my fingers through hers with a tentative squeeze. She looked down, surprise flashing across her face before she squeezed back, the touch hesitant but warm. "Maybe not entirely," I said at last, eyes fixed on the horizon. "But maybe it doesn't have to define us forever." For the first time in weeks, something shifted between us. Not a complete mending, but the softest thread of understanding, a fragile promise that while things might never be the same, they could still be ours. The future was uncertain, and the road back was long. But for tonight, under the bruised sky and the endless rhythm of the sea, it felt possible. And that was enough. The return from the beach marked a subtle change. It was as if speaking openly under the vast, forgiving sky had given us permission to acknowledge the fracture without letting it consume us. But peace was delicate and short-lived. Healing, I was learning, wasn't a linear path. It was jagged, full of setbacks and moments that tested whether moving forward was worth the risk. One evening, Elise returned from work, her expression shadowed by fatigue. She dropped her bag by the door and sank into the couch across from me. We had started to share the living room again, sitting in the same space without the wall of unspoken accusations. But this time, something felt different. "I ran into someone today," she said after a pause, her voice careful. A chill slithered down my spine. I set down the book I hadn't really been reading and looked at her, searching her face for clues. "Who?" "Dr. Mitchell," she said, the name weighted and sharp. My breath caught, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The pain was immediate, a familiar stab of betrayal rekindled by the mere mention of him. "Where?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "At the cafe near my office." He said hello, that's all. I left as soon as I could. She rubbed her temples, eyes closing for a moment as if blocking out the memory. I thought you should know." Her honesty, delivered without defense or pretense, disarmed me. But it also scraped against my raw edges, the old doubts and fears roaring to life. The question hanging between us was unspoken, but clear. Did this mean anything? Did he still have a hold over her thoughts, however fleeting? "Thank you for telling me," I said, the words tasting strange on my tongue. Gratitude and hurt, a bitter cocktail. Silence followed, stretching as we both waited for the other to fill it. When neither of us did, Elise moved closer, the couch cushion sinking under her weight as she crossed the space that had kept us apart. "I know this brings it all back," she whispered, eyes glistening. "And I don't want that for you. For us." The ache softened slightly, dulled by the sincerity in her voice. My mind raced with what-ifs, scenarios where she hadn't told me, where this reminder of our worst moments had been hidden. But she had chosen to speak, to lay it bare even when she knew it would hurt. "It does bring it back," I admitted, my voice rough. "But it's different now." Her eyes widened, a question on her lips that she didn't dare voice. I reached out, tracing the outline of her hand with my fingertips before letting them rest there, solid and warm. "It's different because you told me," I continued. "That matters." She nodded, the tension easing from her shoulders. The relief was palpable, but so was the mutual understanding that this was a test, one of many. Healing wouldn't come without revisiting the pain, confronting it in small doses until it no longer dictated our future. We sat like that for a while, the space between us filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the house settling. It was not perfect, but it was progress. I didn't know if these moments of honesty would be enough to sustain us, or if another crack would one day split us apart again. But what I did know, sitting in that quiet room with her fingers tentatively brushing against mine, was that we were both trying. "Do you want to talk about it more?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Not tonight," I replied, eyes meeting hers. "Tonight, I just want to sit here with you." A small smile curved her lips, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it reached her eyes. It was a look that spoke not of forgiveness fully earned, but of a shared resolve to try, to fight for the fragile bond that had once been unbreakable and could perhaps become strong again. As the night deepened and the shadows settled, we sat side by side, no longer haunted by ghosts, but still navigating the aftermath of their presence. The road was long, the wounds still tender, but there was light filtering through the cracks. And for now, that was enough. Morning came, pale light sifting through the curtains and painting soft, shifting shapes across the bedroom walls. I woke to find Elise already gone from the bed, the faint sounds of her movements drifting in from the kitchen. The house felt different, as if the air itself held its breath, bracing for what was to come. I lingered a moment, staring at the ceiling and replaying the night before, the shared vulnerability, the way her fingers had touched mine with cautious trust. But the memory of Dr. Mitchell's name lingered like an aftertaste, bitter and unwelcome. I found her standing by the kitchen window, a mug cradled between her hands. The sunlight caught her profile, highlighting the worry lines etched along her brow. She turned when she heard me, her eyes meeting mine with an unreadable expression. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, the word too light for the tension pressing on us. I reached for my own cup, letting the silence stretch as I gathered my thoughts. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said last night," I admitted, leaning against the counter. "I know," she said, setting her mug down with a clink. "It's been on my mind too." Running in and brought back everything I thought I'd moved past. My jaw tightened. I wanted to ask if it stirred any lingering feelings, if he still haunted her thoughts the way he did mine. But I swallowed the question, realizing it wouldn't help. "Does it change anything for you, seeing him?" I asked, choosing instead the question that mattered. "No," she said, the certainty in her voice like an anchor. But it made me realize that moving on isn't just about leaving the past behind. It's about facing it when it comes back. The truth in her words resonated, raw and honest. We both needed to confront what had happened, not just skirt around it with careful gestures and polite words. The betrayal wasn't an event. It was a living thing that would surface at inconvenient moments, testing the bonds we were trying to rebuild. "Maybe we need to talk to someone," I said, surprising myself with the suggestion. "Someone who isn't him." Her eyes widened slightly, the idea landing between us like a fragile lifeline. "Couples therapy?" she asked, the hesitation clear but mingled with hope. I nodded. "If we're serious about this, about making it work, we can't just do it alone." We need to understand why it happened in the first place. Her eyes shone with emotion, and she reached across the counter, fingertips brushing mine. The gesture felt deliberate, seeking connection and reassurance. "I want that too," she said, voice steady. The decision to seek therapy was a shift, a declaration that what we had wasn't beyond saving, but also that it needed more than silent determination. We needed to untangle the threads of miscommunication, unmet needs, and the quiet ways we'd let the space between us grow into a chasm. Days turned into weeks as we began the slow, painstaking process of therapy. The first sessions were the hardest. Sitting in a room and reliving every moment that had led us here was brutal, each confession peeling back layers we'd both hidden beneath. Elise spoke about the loneliness that had seeped into her days, how the emotional void had driven her to seek solace where she shouldn't have. I admitted to the blind spots I hadn't wanted to see, the way I'd allowed routine and work to consume me, turning the relationship into something mechanical and predictable. Each revelation stung, but there was power in saying it aloud, in naming the hurts we had let fester. The therapist, a kind woman with a quiet voice, helped us find pieces of understanding we couldn't have reached on our own. We learned to speak with words that weren't barbed, to listen without letting the instinct to defend overwhelm us. Progress was measured in small moments, a shared joke over morning coffee, the way we reached for each other's hands during an awkward pause. One night, as we left the session and stepped into the cool evening air, Elise turned to me, eyes soft under the streetlights. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. I looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had hurt me, but the woman who was fighting just as hard as I was to mend the cracks. "Thank you for choosing to face this with me," I replied, the words carrying the weight of a promise. We walked home together, side by side, no longer defined by the past, but not yet entirely free of it. The road ahead was long, paved with doubts and tests, but it was ours. And that night, for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough.